Hey everyone, this is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today we're going to take a look at Venus's upcoming conjunction with Saturn in the sign of Pisces. I will also be doing some horoscopes later in the week. I'm not sure if that'll be tomorrow or Friday. It's one of the 2 days. And that is because I also have the final part of a 3-part series with Ari Moshe Wolf, comparing evolutionary and ancient approaches to the nodes of the moon. We're going to be looking at a birth chart together. So finishing up that series with him in the new year here, something that we were working on prior to the holidays, if you might remember that series. If you haven't seen that series, by the way, go back and check it out, because the conclusion of that series will make the most sense if you've taken a little bit of time to look at the way that we've talked about the nodes of the moon and compared and contrasted traditions, evolutionary versus ancient, in the first 2 parts of the series. Anyway, so we'll be doing some horoscopes with Venus Saturn as well. And today what we're going to do is look at the conjunction of Venus and Saturn from the standpoint of 5 things to watch for, which is one of my favorite ways on the channel of breaking things down. If you're new to the channel, in this type of episode, I look at an archetypal combination that's floating in the sky this week in particular, and then we unpack it and look at 5 different ways of understanding or noticing the archetypal combination and the likely ways that it shows up in our experience right now. Now, the horoscopes will allow us to see what house this is landing in your birth chart. And so, the combination of these 2 things, generally speaking, really treats the transit in the best way. So anyway, that's what we'll be doing. Remember to like and subscribe. If you're new to the channel, especially liking and subscribing helps us grow the channel. We're seeing if we can't get to 80,000 subscribers by the spring equinox, a couple months worth of a big membership push. I think we can do that. So if you haven't yet subscribed, it's free to do so. It really helps us grow our work. You can find transcripts of any of these daily talks on the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. Tomorrow night, I'm giving a talk on the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries in my monthly webinar series. If you go to the live talks page under events on nightlightastrology.com, you'll see you can register for Encounters at the Edge of Reality, Saturn conjunct Neptune in Aries. It's tomorrow night from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern. If you can't attend live, of course, you get the recorded version of the talk, the audio video. So hope to see some of you there for what should be a good talk on one of the biggest transits of the year, not only this year, but into next year as well. So we're going to be looking at what the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune and Aries might mean for us personally and collectively. All right. Well, on that note, let us now shift our attention over to the real-time clock, where we are going to explore this Venus-Saturn conjunction. Now, this week we've been looking at a couple of things because it's a pretty busy week astrologically. So yesterday we were looking at the sun's opposition to Mars, which is also perfecting today. Here we go. So you could easily spend some time today, if you haven't yet, looking back at yesterday's video on the Mars Sun opposition, which is also a major transit this week. It's sort of like the full moon of the Mars retrograde cycle. Then we are looking today at something that just passed, which is Venus square to Jupiter. We didn't do a video devoted to this square, but when the 2, I mentioned a little bit in the weekly overview, when the 2 benefics get together, generally speaking, good things happen. It's interesting that this Venus-Jupiter square with reception, with Venus exalted, is coming right around the time Jupiter is turning direct, and then Venus is heading right into this conjunction with Saturn, which kind of, in a way, translates the light between Jupiter and Saturn and reiterates the transformations that the Jupiter-Saturn square is still working on within us. So we could look at this Venus-Saturn conjunction from the standpoint of some of the Jupiter-Saturn themes that have been active in our lives. And so if you've been tracking that transit with me on the channel, it's something to consider that this Venus-Saturn conjunction may be playing a role in the larger Jupiter-Saturn dynamic that's taking place in your life and in your birth chart right now. I'm not going to spend a ton of time with that today because that's kind of a, it's like, what is it? What do they say? It's threading a needle. It's like moving something through a very small and delicate space that I think for many people may not land because it really requires that you've been spending a lot of time and attention with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. And that's a harder one for most people to track because it's so long and big and points to things that are so paradigmatically large. So anyway, I'm not going to spend a ton of time. I thought about it. I was like, but I decided, no, we're going to focus a little bit more exclusively on Venus and Saturn. As we go, I will say sprinkle in just a few little thoughts about the fact that Venus is coming off from the square to Jupiter and effectively translating the light between Jupiter and Saturn, but it will be sort of minimal. What I'm going to focus on right now is first, let's look at the timeline, and then let's look at some things to watch for, given that Venus is conjoining Saturn. So if we take this forward just a couple days here, we're going to see that it is Saturday into Sunday that Venus conjoins Saturn. It's January 18th, that's Saturday, but you can feel this building once it gets to within about 3 degrees. That's the engagement range, which is today, January 15th. So between now and the 18th, we get the conjunction, and then give it about 3 degrees of separation. That takes us through Wednesday of next week. During that time, the 3-degree engagement range was really the time during which ancient astrologers saw the promise of the contact between the two planets, the promised events in terms of destiny or fate, sort of showing themselves or blossoming. It's a bit like saying, do you feel or experience the full moon the morning of, or the morning after, or the evening of? There's a range in which we often feel and experience the promised events of a full moon. And everybody knows that. It's the same thing with transits, and ancient astrologers had a 3-degree range that they use for transits for the most part. So we're going to use that as well. So that means that today through Saturday, we're going to be in the range in which the promised fruits of the Venus-Saturn conjunction may appear on the tree. And then they may fall off the tree or continue appearing all the way till next Wednesday. So that's the timeline. Always important to establish the timeline first. Now what I want to do is talk about the 5 things that you can watch for given this combination. There's a few things to say to set ourselves up. First, Venus has a lot of dignity in Pisces. By dignity, we mean that she's in an environment that is more conducive to her own natural significations: love, beauty, romance, sensuality, desire. All Venusian things are heightened and amplified and empowered in the sign of Pisces, a double-bodied water sign, the temple of the fishes, a feminine sign, a changeable sign. This is a sign that Venus does very well in, and she was said to be exalted here. Now, there are a lot of really interesting esoteric reasons for the placement of dignities, but one of them that's really beautiful here is that we're in the place in which the longing for spring and the transformation of the light of winter into the light of spring is taking place. That is really at the heart of the meaning of the sign of Pisces. And so that flowering place of the light and spring and life coming back, we have this goddess of sensuality and fertility, imagination, romance. It's a bit like, the birds and the bees in springtime starting to get together, right? So this sign has a lot of peak romantic Venusian qualities. It is a sign of tremendous longing and tremendous heart and compassion and romance and sentimentality. Not necessarily in a bad way, though sometimes, right? It can lean into like dramatic, theatrical, but there's a kind of grand, peak, romantic, imaginal quality to Venus and Pisces that makes it one of the more attractive places for Venus in the zodiac. Not without shadows, of course. Every placement has its light and dark side, but this is why Venus does so well here, is that generally speaking, this environment is conducive to Venus really being herself. Put Venus in a different sign, right? And then she's sort of filtering her nature through the nature of another planet. And then it depends on how those planets get along with one another. Put Venus in Sagittarius is not a bad place, but now Venus is filtering her expression through the lens of Jupiter, who's quite different from Venus. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it's like very different. Venus in Pisces, right? Now we're in a Jupiter ruled sign, but it's also a place that Venus does very well in. And so some of the meanings of this sign also have to do with this kind of crossover between some of the Jupiterian themes like hope, religion, philosophy, mysticism, and otherworldliness. It's kind of the feminine sort of otherworldly dimensions of Jupiter in this sign. And then we're adding Venus in and giving it this romantic, sensual dimension. So this is really the place where things like beliefs and convictions and philosophy and mysticism and religion, for example, take on romantic qualities, so that you might see someone here who's very passionate, a passionate mystic, but you also might see someone who's more of a musician or poet and more of an artist. it's an interesting sign in that respect. Not that you can't see some interesting expressions of art and poetry in Sagittarius either, but this sign lends itself more to the romantic, the artistic, the sensual, and the feminine dimensions of Jupiter as well, which makes it a very interesting place to consider Venus from. So, given this little setup, let's go into some of what happens when Venus encounters Saturn in this sign. Saturn in this sign in particular is very melancholic. And the reason for that is that we're putting Saturn into a very moist, like Venusian environment, a place that is, when Saturn is in the place where Venus is exalted, the really intense melancholic qualities of Saturn can be a big part of the experience, and amplified by a Venus conjunction to Saturn in the sign of Pisces. So one of the things we're going to look at here in this list is the consistent way in which melancholy appears with this combination. But melancholy has a range of meanings that are themselves really interesting. So let's get to it. First of all, Saturn is a planet that has always been associated with gravitas. So there's a sense of the seriousness of life and the consequential nature of actions and choices and plot lines playing out in life. There is a very clear way in which many ancient traditions believed that life is a stage, or life is a kind of play. In the grandest sense, it is a play of light and dark. It is the dance of light and dark, of yin and yang, of the opposites and the fluctuation of opposites along spectrums, that reality itself is a play, and that we play a role. Each of us individually play a part on the stage of life. And you'll see in most ancient mystical traditions some really careful and important instructions on making sure that you remember it's a play, because when you're in the midst of it, it's like you're method acting. And method acting, it's very important that you fully believe that you are the role you are playing. And for method actors, you kind of lose yourself in the role. And there's so many stories about people who have done method acting and the losing of themselves in that role, playing it in and outside of the actual performance, playing the role in and outside of actual rehearsals and so forth, can be really consequential. It can have big consequences. It can lead to award-winning performances, and it can lead to people going off the rails mentally and emotionally. And this is sort of like an analogy. So in life, we're method acting. Our ego, our identity, the roles we're playing, the life we're here to live, the dharma that comes with us, all of this is like a form of method acting. And when you're method acting, everything is of grave and serious consequence because it's real. You've really identified with the role you're playing. So all these ancient traditions had a way of saying, okay, well, look, when you're method acting, things get real serious. So in order to not be completely sabotaged by the roller coaster ride of life when you're method acting, remember it's a play. You have to remember you can't completely lose yourself. You have to have some way of differentiating yourself from the play and the role and the method acting. If we need to be woken up or stirred awake to remember, I'm method acting, it's a play, nothing better than a Venus-Saturn conjunction in Pisces. Because one of the things it can do is it can bring about the most consequential dimensions of the imagined life that we're living. The role we're playing on stage comes to a moment of great consequence. And that great consequence in the big picture of things, the big picture might not be the world's biggest thing. I mean, this is a transit that lasts a couple of days. For some people, it's maybe activating planets in your chart. It'll be a little bit more intense. But what I mean by this is not to say it's the world's most important event, but there will be things that happen when Venus conjoins Saturn that make you go, okay, the imaginal world I live in. Like when kids play, I had a friend tell me this recently. I thought it was a great way of explaining it. When kids pretend that they're superheroes, or when my girls pretend that they're princesses, or that they're the owners of a dog shelter in our basement that they've made up, these roles and worlds they create that they're so interested in. Of course, that happened after we got a dog from dog shelter. So they enter into that world, they fully get involved and invested in it. Well, we adults are all still doing the same thing. We just don't think about it that way. So along comes something of great consequence, and when we're a kid and you're playing a game, it might be like, oh man, that's a buzzkill, or that was a really heavy thing. And if it's feeling too heavy, you can always just change the way you're playing the game, or you can stop playing the game or something like that. It's a little harder when you're an adult, and we have bought in so deeply to the play of life, the Leela, the Maya. So there's a kind of illusory dimension of these worlds we create and these lives we're living in. Venus conjoined Saturn in her exaltation in Pisces, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, here's a moment of great consequence, of great seriousness. And it makes you question, am I in a dream? Is this a play? Or it might give you some pause and reminder that this is a moment of a lot of seriousness, and I need to remember that I'm a spirit soul, that this is an experience happening in the material world where there's this play going on. And if I can remember that, then I can go through something that's serious without feeling like everything in the universe is at stake. It's a big part of something like Venus conjoined Saturn in Pisces. Yes, it's consequential, but can I have a little bit of healthy distance or perspective so that I don't become caught up in a moment that, suddenly it's Shakespearean, and it might be, it's not like you have to ignore it or not take it seriously, but you also don't have to get lost in it. All right, number 2, refined, deepened, matured Venus. Venus contacts Saturn, and I've used this example many times on the channel. It's like the kind of process involved in taking a bottle of wine, and then, 80 years later, 100 years later, whatever, it becomes its perfect vintage. Is that what it's called? The vintage? Or it becomes its perfect form. This is the peak time in which you should drink the wine in order to experience all of its promise. So Venus contacts with Saturn can also mean that there's something Venusian that's ripening, that's deepening, that's perfecting, that's reaching its limit. But that limit is an expression of its richness and its beauty. There's certain times in life where you realize, I'm at my peak. I'm at the peak of my game, or I'm in the these are the good old days, and I'm in them right now. It's a very Venus Saturn kind of feeling. So anything that represents a maturation, a refinement, or a deepening of Venus can be felt during such a transit. Watch for that. Number 3 is the death of Venus. On the opposite side of things, we have Saturn representing death and expiration and limit. And from what I understand, with certain wines, if you don't drink within a certain amount of time and they keep going beyond it, I think it can get worse. Now, correct me if I'm wrong for people who know more about wine than I do, but either way, there's like an expiration date. You don't eat the food in the fridge. You don't eat the fruit or whatever it is beyond the expiration date. So Venus contacting Saturn can also be about the natural limit of something, the natural expiration of something. Sometimes it doesn't feel natural, but in a fated or destined way, it obviously is. But it can be about endings around Venusian things: love, beauty, a style, taste, aesthetic, people in your life, relationships, anything Venusian that says, that's it. Number 4, transitions from one world or era to the next for Venus. See, the other thing that Saturn was associated with traditionally was not just death or limitations, but also about boundaries and thresholds. Crossing a threshold from one thing to another, one world or another, especially when there is a sense of having to leave the old behind, and a death or an ending that serves as a transition, was very Saturnian. Well before we had Pluto, Lord of Death and Rebirth, we had Saturn. That entailed the idea of moving from a place and reaching its limit, feeling the expiration, and then moving beyond it. This is why Saturn was associated, with mysticism and with people who left the world behind in order to move beyond the threshold of this world into mystical states of consciousness. Saturn was one of the key planets associated with things like hermits, monks, mystics, contemplatives, people who spent lots of times in libraries or monasteries or in prayer, sort of at a distance from the world, seeking an entrance into the other world. All right. So 5 is the melancholic Venus. Now, things that were associated with melancholy that you may not know would be like dark but beautiful feelings, longings, a sense of divine futility or frustration, existential angst, an inventiveness rooted in feeling bored or disappointed with the status quo. So, melancholics in the ancient world were a diverse range of people that could be described as melancholic. Some of them would be suffering from melancholy, and others would be living somewhat more productively, let's say, with the condition of melancholy. Poets, dreamers, mystics, anyone who has the experience of being an outcast or of being marginalized or feeling like they're on the other side of a boundary of normalcy or conventionality were all considered Saturnian. So, for example, the black sheep, the outcast, the punk rocker, anyone who is holding a tension between normalcy or conventionality and something other, that tension between the opposites was held by Saturn, was also often a part of the experience of melancholy. Melancholy, if I think back to the 1990s, right, one of the great Saturnian albums, if you think about it from the standpoint of what the ancients thought about Saturn, the great Saturnian album was Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. It was so beautiful, but so filled with angst and a sort of whimsical depressiveness, a sense of emptiness with respect to the world, but this yearning for things like the stars and faraway romantic imaginative landscapes. That's very Saturnian. Venus and Saturn can bring up just this. It's like an antique store crossed with poetry and music, crossed with a feeling of disappointment that the world couldn't be more than it is. All of that produces some of the most consistent art, music, poetry, mysticism. That mood is common among spiritual people and artistic people. It's not the only common mood. There are others, and doesn't mean you have to be a melancholic to be spiritual or something like that. But the melancholic Venus is very much at play this week. So watch for it. Just watch for that mood. And what's your interaction with it? What's your relationship to it if and when you see it? Or maybe you notice it in someone else around you too. Anyhow, 5 things to watch for with respect to Venus conjoining Saturn. Now, as promised, I want to say, there was a few moments where I skipped past something I wanted to say, just briefly with respect to Venus coming off from the square to Jupiter. So remember that Jupiter-Saturn, I'm just going to say a few little things about this. Remember that Jupiter and Saturn are within 3 degrees of a square to one another still, which means that they are themselves, the fruit on the Jupiter-Saturn tree is appearing. The fruit on the Jupiter-Saturn tree, putting it simply, has to do with major, long-term, slow-moving, developmental, process-oriented changes, paradigmatic changes in our understanding, our philosophy, our beliefs, our convictions, thoughts and perceptions, and organizing structures, whether that's in work or love or parenting, or it's just, psychologically, you're growing and maturing in your worldview or your personal outlook. Jupiter-Saturn dynamics almost always include transitions from one era to another with respect to the kinds of wisdom or understanding or just our maturity on the level of, how can I put it? It's like each of us have a process of enlightenment that we're going through. And Jupiter is very much there as a kind of guru, instructor, professor who's always helping us develop broader, deeper, more thorough or complete understanding of life, of ourselves, or of specific areas of life. When Jupiter and Saturn get together, they're helping us shift from the expiration of one form of understanding into another, just like I was talking about with Saturn and Venus. So this Venus-Saturn dynamic is participating in a larger, deeper kind of transition. Can you follow that? I hope that should make sense. So everything we just talked about for Venus-Saturn is aiding in this deeper, longer-term process of Jupiter and Saturn revising paradigms and structures in our lives, which we have covered on this channel many times in depth. Go back and watch any of the videos that we've done on Jupiter-Saturn square since August. There's probably at least 6 or 7 of them. And if you want a little more on that part of it, if you're new to the channel and haven't heard those yet, you might go back and listen to those. But just know that this Venus-Saturn dynamic is actually participating in a deeper and more substantial level of paradigmatic change in our lives. But it's subtle, and picking up on exactly how that connection is being made, that's a more difficult level of tracking for most of us. So that's why I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but enough to say, if you have been tracking that, pay attention to how this moment with Venus-Saturn might be participating in that dynamic. All right. On that note, I will say goodbye for now, and we will see you again. We've got horoscopes, and then the final installation of my conversations with Ari. We're going to be reading a chart together and comparing and contrasting, traditional approaches to the nodes of the moon and modern traditional approaches to the nodes and the modern evolutionary approach. So enjoy that too. All right. See you later. Bye.